Erin Kopek, and I'm the Marketing Director for Higher Level, a workforce management resource. Thank you for tuning in today to our webinar program. We're going on close to 4 years of doing the webinar program on a monthly basis, and we decided to do this for our clients, friends, and prospects, just kind of an added value to educate you on different topics. And so diversity and inclusion is actually something, it's a new topic we'll be talking about today. And so we'll begin momentarily. Our webinar program is really a way to listen to these presentations and to increase your workplace efficiency. That's really the goal from this, is just learning and growing your business. Just a few things before we get started. You're currently set up in listen-only mode. So if you do have any questions, feel free to type in those questions at the end of the presentation, and I will facilitate those. So let's get started. I will introduce Katrina. She is the Diversity Awareness Partnership Education and Training Manager. So she trains new clients in diversity and inclusion and supports organizations in implementing diversity initiatives. Katrina holds a master's degree in clinical adult psychology from Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, and an undergraduate degree in psychology from Webster University. Katrina also serves as an adjunct faculty at Southern Illinois University of Edwardsville, teaching about multicultural issues in psychology at the graduate and undergraduate level. In her previous role as multicultural counselor, she provided mental health treatment to unrepresented students and developed outreach and programming specific to the needs of underrepresented students on campus. She has also been a part of the campus climate committees, where she gained experience evaluating the climate of diversity in an educational setting. I thank you again for tuning in, and Katrina, I turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Erin. Well, thanks everyone for signing into this webinar. Hopefully you'll get something good out of some of these topics that we're going to talk about today. So we're primarily going to focus on some general concepts and topics around the topic of diversity and inclusion. So it's going to be a basic training and maybe some things that you've heard before or come across before. But I want to try to give you information that's not only applicable to your job settings and your workplace, but also things that are going to be helpful for you in just your everyday life and your everyday interactions. So I'll just start off the presentation by lecturing almost to you for about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up for questions at the end. So hopefully by the end of this, you'll be able to describe the difference between diversity and inclusion. So you'll be able to have developed some language around diversity and inclusion as a topic, and to have a basic understanding of different diverse groups, and including the current language that is applicable to these groups and social categories, and also be able to describe the impact of unconscious bias, stereotypes that we may have, and micro inequities that are in your actual organization. So hopefully this can be applied to your work as well. So when we talk about a difficult topic like diversity and inclusion, it can be very sensitive, and a lot of times the people that you're talking with identify with maybe one or more groups that we'll be covering. And so it's important to have the sensitivity to talk about these things. So these are the group norms that we at Diversity Awareness Partnership use for every single presentation that we do. I'm going to point out a couple of them that may apply the best to this webinar setting today, and that's just to listen carefully and to be open to learning. Like I said, this may be something that you've heard a lot about before, or this might be very new to you. We never expect that everyone's going to agree with everything that we say, but just to have an open mind and be open to learning. That's all we ask of all of you. So those are the group norms in the introduction, so we can start with the actual presentation. So I want to start off by making sure that we are all on the same page about what diversity means, because I think depending on the area that we live in, when we hear the word diversity, we all come up with ideas about what that looks like. And a lot of times there's a lack of appreciation for what diversity actually is. So when we talk about diversity, I want you to think about it in terms of all of the kinds of things that are listed here. So it's very common to look at the column on the left and think diversity is the stuff that we're able to see in people, or the categories that we've created for people. Things like race, religion, sexual orientation, what somebody's age is, or what we think somebody's age is. That's the way we typically view diversity. And we're not really doing diversity justice, and we don't always have an actual diverse setting when we think about diversity in that very simplistic way. So when we talk about diversity, what we're actually talking about is not only that left column there, but the right column as well. So diversity also includes just the other kinds of differences that we have that allow us to have valuable, unique, challenging perspectives, values, belief systems, and those come from a lot of other things as well. Things like your skills, your problem-solving techniques, your perspectives, your backgrounds, what education you have, your job, and the jobs that you've had in the past that have built your ideas about what work is and the kind of person that you are. So when we talk about diversity, I want you all to think about it in this kind of way. And what's interesting is that the left column is what's most typically identified by older generations as what diversity is. But younger generations are challenging that belief and bringing in the idea and understanding that diversity also includes the things on the right as well. So I want you all to see it in this way. And when you think about people in your lives, yourself, and think about the diversity that you have to offer and contribute to your workplace, I want you to value all parts of what your own diversity may look like by evaluating some of the other things you see in these columns. And also to recognize the difference between diversity and inclusion. So when we talk about diversity, we really are focusing on the difference that is present. So oftentimes you'll hear who is at the table is what diversity is referring to. But there's a much bigger push now to focus a lot more on that inclusion piece, because what we're finding is that just because the diversity is there doesn't mean that the diversity is actually being utilized. So the inclusion piece is really focusing on how do we create an environment and setting where all of the diversity is being valued equally and everybody that's there has an equal voice at the table. So a lot of the work that we do doesn't necessarily focus on so much the diversity piece, because that piece cannot stand alone, but it focuses more on that inclusion piece. So how do we make sure that all of that diversity is not only being seen as a strength, but is being utilized in the right ways, and all of that diversity that is present is feeling comfortable, valued, and all of those things. So we've developed somewhat of a formula that helps to better understand how that inclusion piece is sometimes missing in the workplace and even in our interactions with people just on in our daily lives. So this kind of sets up the framework for talking about implicit bias or unconscious bias. And the reason why we really like to focus on this topic here is because what we're finding and what research is finding is that the issues that are presenting themselves with diversity aren't as much related to these very obvious racist, sexist, ageist things that are happening in the workplace. What they're more related to and where people are falling short and workplaces are falling short is not understanding that there are more subtle things that are going on in our daily lives and experiences that are creating separation between us and people that are not like us. And so that's where this research in implicit bias or unconscious bias really started taking off. And this implicit bias, this idea, really started to come into the research in the 80s. And it defines it as not necessarily a bad thing. So our implicit bias can be good or bad, and it operates at a level below our conscious awareness. And it's subtle, and it's a cognitive process that really allows us to make very quick decisions about things and people that we interact with. And so it can serve very important purpose for us. And it can be seen as a mental shortcut which when you think about it sounds very efficient and effective, and that's exactly what it is. So our brains are actually designed in a way to help us be more effective in our daily lives, and that's where that implicit bias comes from. So how can I look at a situation or be in a situation and manage it in the most effective, efficient way possible? That's the way our minds are designed. So it can actually be a very, very good thing. We're processing millions of bits of information in one moment. And so if we had to sit and process all of that every time we were confronted with it, we would not live very effective lives, and we would really not be able to do much at all. That would take up a lot of our energy and a lot of our time. So we are more effective in the way that we think, and we use our experiences of the past. We use how we're feeling. We use all of these things to make quick decisions for us, and to make snap judgments about what we're doing, why we're doing it, and who the people are that we are interacting with. So, for example, we all have implicit bias, and we all have these stereotypes and unconscious biases that we use and live with every single day. And that does not make us bad people. That just makes us people. And so being aware of what that looks like is really important. So one example of a stereotype or an unconscious bias I have that I want to keep for a very long time is one that keeps me safe. So for example, if I'm walking down a path and I have two options in front of me, I can either go to the left, and it's a very well-lit sidewalk that's well populated, and if I look over at the right, it's a dark alley where no one else is around. I'm very quickly going to know that I should go to the left, that I should go down that well-lit path with the sidewalk that's well populated. That's not because I have a bias that I'm aware of, but that happens because my mind is helping me keep safe. It's making this very quick decision for me and allowing me to make a very quick decision without using very much energy. So it can be a very, very good thing. And bias actually does help us to live our lives in an effective way. Where we can get into trouble is when we start to apply it to groups of people, which we all do. But we really start to get in trouble when we don't know when we're applying it to groups of people. And I think that's where a lot of the push is going to start to help promote that inclusion, especially within the workplace. So how can we start to become more aware of not only the biases that we have, but how to challenge them when they occur and when they influence how we interact with people and how we behave towards people. So most of the time, these biases and these stereotypes, because they're happening at a level that's not in our conscious awareness, usually they're unintentional. So again, they're the snap judgment. They're acting without having to put a lot of energy and thought behind how we're acting. We don't necessarily have to attend to that information. It's quick, it's effortless, and it's usually unintentional. And so when we look at the process of that, this formula helps to break it down. So I want to look at that first circle with the interpretation, and that's referring to our preconceived ideas. So what's already stored in my mind about groups of people? And then we're going over to that perception circle. And when we talk about the perception, we're really thinking about what behaviors am I seeing, or what characteristics am I seeing that just confirm what I already believe. So the information that we already believe, plus what we're seeing, hearing, that confirms what we already believe. And those two things work together to really influence the way that we interact with people and interact with the spaces that we're in and interact with the world that we're in. But today we're really going to focus on the way that it impacts people. So it influences how we behave towards people, individuals that we know, who identify with these groups that we already have information in our mind about. And so there has been a lot of studies and surveys that really look at what these interpretations, perceptions could be in people and how that influences their interactions. So we looked at a study done in 2011 that was conducted by a human resources management group. And it asked HR individuals, and they chose HR because HR typically has a lot of training around topics like this, just to get at whether or not there was that bias and those stereotypes present in the work that they do. So one of the things that they looked at was how what view employees have of their coworkers when talking about certain social groups. And the reason why they asked about not their own opinions, but the opinion they have about what their coworkers may believe, is because that is a better way to get at what the bias may be. Because usually people will say, I view these groups of people very positively, right? So your conscious beliefs are going to be different than those implicit beliefs that you may have. So that's the way this survey was designed to get at the more unconscious belief systems. So one of the examples of the questions was employees who use a wheelchair are less competent than non-chair users. And the question was asked in a way where individuals reading it would be answering whether or not they thought their coworkers had this belief. And 68.5% respondents believe that this was true in this 2011 disability study. So they believed that their coworkers viewed people who use wheelchairs as less competent than non-chair users. And then going over to the perception, I'm not sure if there's a lag or if it's not. Okay, here we go. So with the perception piece, it's if an employee in a wheelchair seems to be confused or asks questions about a certain task, your perception is then affirmed. So if you have this belief, if you think that in your workplace, people believe that employees that use a wheelchair are less competent, then if you see somebody in a wheelchair that looks confused or asks a question, then your interpretation is being confirmed. And that's the way that those two things work together. With those two working together, that influences the way that we behave towards different groups of people. So in terms of that last piece, the type of interaction that is taking place, this can lead to for you to delegate less meaningful tasks to people in wheelchairs, or to assign them work that isn't as important as somebody that you would assign to somebody that is not in a wheelchair. So that's the way that these systems work in our minds. And like I said, usually people will not say, I believe that people that use wheelchairs are less competent than non-chair users. But this is getting at what's happening under your conscious awareness. So you have a belief system that is already established in your mind, whether you're aware of it or not, based on your experiences, based on what you've been told, based on how people around you and have talked about people in wheelchairs, based on media interpretations and all those sorts of things, plus the information that you are perceiving, and if it confirms what you already believe, and that leads to interacting with that person in a way that's influenced by that unconscious belief, whether you are aware of it or not. So hopefully breaking it down in that kind of way can make it a little bit easier to understand. So I want to talk a little bit about the research behind the implicit associations and the unconscious bias that we're talking about so much. So like I said, in the 80s is when this research really started to come out, and it came out from Harvard. So Harvard started doing this test called the implicit association test. It's a free test, it's online, and there are many tests that have come out of it that focus on a lot of different identity groups. The one that we are going to focus on today is race. That is the one with the most research behind it and was developed first. So what this test does is it tries to get at what your implicit bias is by measuring how quickly you can categorize people with certain words, or it measures what you interpret these categorizations between social groups and categories like good or bad with the groups. So for this test here, what they did was you sit at a computer and it provides you with two categories. One category is words that are good, and the second category is words that are bad. And what you're supposed to do is you are given a face, and so this face is either a face of African American descent or a face that is Caucasian. And you're supposed to assign it with the right category. So let's say for round one, every time you see an African American face, you're supposed to assign it to the category of good words. If you see a Caucasian face, you're supposed to assign it to the category of words that are bad. And then in round two, that will switch. And the purpose of that is to see how quickly we're able to make these associations in our mind. So what is that snap judgment? What is your mind doing on that unconscious level, and how quickly is it able to do that? And so what they found was that across the board, regardless of who you are, where you live, what your race or ethnicity is, how old you are, that the results tended to be very similar. And also to preface that, part of what this research did was simply ask, what are your beliefs about different racial groups? And most people would say that they were accepting two different racial groups, that they were not racist. And so the unconscious bias doesn't necessarily align with people's conscious biases or conscious beliefs. So with the results, it showed that significantly people had a strong preference, or more of a preference for, or positive preference for, people that were white. So people have a harder time attributing positive characteristics or words to people that they believe are Black or African American. So this result was very alarming, and it's been going on for a long time, and millions of users have taken this test, and the result remains the same. The only exception is that people that identify themselves as African American or Black tended to have a slight preference for African American or Black faces that they saw, and attributing those faces to more positive words. So this research really brings light to the types of biases that we have. So even if we are people that do not consciously hold these negative beliefs about different racial groups, our unconscious biases lead us to have a harder time to attribute positive characteristics and ideas and values and beliefs towards groups that are racially diverse. And in this case, specifically, people that are Black or African American. So this is more in line with what people are facing in their daily experiences at work. And we're seeing that this does manifest itself in the workplace and in interactions with people that may look different than you. So I think it's important too to recognize why this may be happening. So why is it that even people that do not identify as being racist or having racist beliefs still have a preference for people that are white? Well, research is coming out that there are a lot of reasons why this may happen. A lot of it comes from what your exposure is. So who are the people in your social circles? Who are the people in your workplace that you're able to say, okay, this is my interpretation and perception of groups of people that look like this. So exposure is a big piece of that. Another reason could be just what kinds of messages are you getting in your daily life, and have you been getting about people in these different groups? And if you think about the media, if you think about the marketing that takes place, we are given a lot of negative messages about different racial groups that happen maybe in a way that we're not as aware of the impact that they have on us as we are becoming at this point. So what is the news telling us about people that are Black or African American? What are other media outlets telling us? So what are these messages that we're receiving on a daily basis about different groups of people? Also in a workplace, so who are our teachers? Who are our leaders? What do they look like? So all of those things really work towards allowing these biases that we have to continue and manifest themselves in the work that we do. Also, just the way that our minds are structured, we actually have a harder time feeling warmth towards people that don't look like us. And that's problematic, but that's just a human trait that we have. And that's the way that our brains and minds work. So if I'm interacting with somebody that looks like me, it's a lot easier for me to attribute my good qualities to that person because we have that connection, because they look like me, and I make a lot of assumptions about what that means. So next, we're going to talk about how this implicit bias or unconscious biases manifest themselves in the workplace. And they can happen in many different ways. What research identifies as the term that really talks about what this is microinequities or microaggressions. And when we talk about these microaggressions, we're talking about things that are pretty passive. They're apparently small events that happen very often for people, that are really hard to prove, often very unintentional, frequent, again, happening over and over again, that perpetuates this idea of separation, or continues to make that person feel like there's something about them that is different or wrong or misinterpreted. And so it creates that lack of inclusion. It creates that discomfort, that fear, that feeling of isolation. And so some examples of how that manifests, I've listed on this slide here. And these tend to be microaggressions that we hear pretty often in our trainings. And so the first one, taking more questions from men than women. A lot of research in the corporate world really focuses on trying to identify how microaggressions come into play when you look at why there aren't, as women are underrepresented in leadership roles and things along those lines. And so some of the microaggressions that fall into that research are women being interrupted more, women being perceived in certain ways, even if men are saying the same thing as women. So that is a microaggression that takes place within the workplace when we're talking about men versus women. Assuming someone's racial identity, that can be that is identified as a microaggression as well, because we often attribute racial identity to characteristics. And so we can often do that in a way that isn't correct. And so everybody's racial identity is really their decision. And so we often make the mistake of trying to identify that for somebody. Shortening someone's name is something that we hear pretty often too. A lot of times it's coming from a place of good intent. Like, I don't want to make you uncomfortable by messing up your name, so I'm going to identify a name that's easier to say. But what we're finding is that has a negative impact, because that's telling somebody that you don't accept a piece of their culture, especially if there's a lot of cultural meaning behind their name. And a lot of phrases and things that we see come up often in our trainings that people are saying in a way where they're that it isn't intentional to harm somebody. So saying things like, oh, you are so articulate to a woman or a person of color, or saying something like, I don't think of you as Black because I don't even see your color, or asking questions like, when did you arrive in this country? And so seeing them alone, you might not be able to see how that can impact someone negatively. But when you think about the space that this person might be in, if they're hearing this from their boss or someone that has authority over them, and if they're hearing this over and over and over again, that can have a very big impact on how separated they feel from their colleagues, from their workplace, and from the clients that they're trying to serve. So this is just a very short and small touch up on microaggressions. But I think if you are interested in learning more, that this is where the information is going to be really applicable to your workplace. How are these microaggressions happening in your own work setting that continues to create the separation between people in the workplace, especially those that are more diverse? So now we're going to go into just touching on some important differences within within social identities, and we're going to start with talking about differences in race. So, well, first, why is this important? So we talked about unconscious bias, microaggressions, and now we're going into different social identities. And I think that this page here highlights why this is important. So when we talk about diversity, and we have in the past, it may have been easier to ignore, but now we're seeing that we are not able to escape diversity. Our workplaces, our communities, our environments are becoming more and more diverse. And we can see that when we look at the numbers and we look at the statistics. Even looking at the slide here, you can see that different racial groups are growing, and the population of non-Hispanic white is shrinking. So when you just think about what your community may look like and what your workplace may look like, you are not going to be able to escape that diversity. And so it's important to provide ourselves the tools to be able to recognize what could potentially be offensive, how we can create a fair, equal environment for all. And so that's really why learning about these things and becoming more interested in these things is going to be important. So we know that we all likely hold some bias towards various racial groups that do negatively impact their experiences. So let's look at some of the important focus on differences within racial categories. So race itself is made up of social concepts that are typically attributed to differences in characteristics. And the intention of this categorization is many reasons, but it does create a lot of separation between us. And so that's where a lot of these biases racially can come in and ethnically can come in. So if we continue to create separation between us without a true understanding of what different cultures may look like, then we have a lot of misinterpretation of what those differences actually are. And it continues to create that us-them, whether it's in our daily interactions or in the workplace or whatever. So statistically, we just have to be aware and have to recognize without defensiveness that we likely all hold some unconscious bias towards certain racial groups and stereotypes towards certain racial groups. That, again, does not make us bad people, because when we look at how those kinds of things have developed, it's through the media, it's through our socialization. So a lot of it in our society, we're unable to escape. However, we do need to do a better job of not being defensive about knowing that information, becoming more aware of it so that we can stop how it negatively impacts the people around us. So that awareness piece is going to be an important piece of how racial difference in our interactions with others can be more inclusive. Another important point is to recognize the importance of debate versus dialogue. So when we talk about racial difference, that can create a lot of tension for people and misunderstanding for people. And a lot of times it's because it's coming from this place of wanting to debate your ideas and saying this is the right answer, this is the wrong answer. So we recommend that you always approach conversations about race in a format that focuses on dialogue. It's not about somebody winning and losing. It's about gaining information about one another in a way that's going to be productive for everybody. And just be more mindful of what you surround yourself with. So what is your exposure to different racial and ethnic groups? And what can you do to fight against that bias? So how can you expose yourself to something that challenges those media interpretations and cultural representations that you see that may not be accurate? And then just be open to having that dialogue. What we know about unconscious bias when it comes to race and ethnicity is that the more that we learn and gain the tools to have conversations about these things, the more understanding we gain from one another. So the next category that we would like to talk about in this diversity training is religion. So religion is one topic that seems to be not as well talked about within the workplace. It tends to be a topic where workplaces just want to kind of step away from and not make present. So the less that religion and religious difference is present, it seems the more comfortable workplaces are. However, that creates a lot of exclusion for people because a lot of the policies and things that we do have in place in the workplace are really catered to that dominant religion, which you can see from the numbers here that's Christianity or Catholicism. So if our structures are built around catering to those religious groups, then a lot of other religious groups do feel that exclusion in the workplace. So looking at the numbers, it also applies to when we're talking about religion, that diversity is going to present itself and is more likely to present itself in the workplace. So it's important to recognize some of the topics or things that may occur in the workplace that could be negatively impacting people that do identify differently. So some of the major points of consideration will be things that I have listed on this slide here, and we'll talk about each of these a little bit. So first, we want to talk about holidays. Workplaces tend to have recognition of certain holidays where you're allowed to take time off, you're allowed to take vacation, things along those lines. So being more aware of what religious groups you are catering to when you're thinking about holidays, days off, and when people are assigned their work days or work hours, and what religious groups may be excluded from that. So being more open to using an interfaith calendar, something when you're planning your events, making sure that you don't have a huge event on a day where there's maybe a Muslim holiday and all your Muslim employees won't be able to come. Recognizing what major religious holidays people in your workplace may be practicing and celebrating, and just trying to be sensitive of them maybe wanting that time off or needing that time away. The same you would do for maybe Catholic Christian holidays, because that just seems to be more typical in our US setting and in most workplaces that we see. Also thinking about food and dietary restrictions, food and diet can be a very important piece of somebody's religious practice. Regardless of what religion you are in, I think it's important to recognize that food and dietary restrictions do present themselves a lot more frequently than people are aware of. So thinking about if you're doing a lunch and learn, if you have a party and alcohol is being provided for people, what kinds of food are being provided for people? The same way you would think about maybe if you had a vegetarian employee and if you were providing food that this employee was able to eat at a party. But to also consider if you have other religious groups represented, to make sure that if this person is invited to the party or the meeting or whatever event is taking place, that they're actually going to be able to eat. So we've seen that sometimes it happens where someone will, or a company will throw an event and this person will have to come to it because of their role within the organization. And there will actually be no food available or provided for them that they are able to eat because of religious dietary restrictions. And you can see that can be very uncomfortable for someone. This person was very high up in the company. They were eating with other very important people in their work, and they kind of had to sit there and not eat while everybody else around them ate. And so this can be a very small thing, but again, it can have a huge impact on someone and create a lot of separation between them and the people that they're trying to work with or serve. Another is just being cautious of prayer and ritual. So religious practice may call for somebody to have to find a space or take breaks or have some privacy in their workplace or in their work setting that will allow them to practice their prayer or rituals. And this can go a really long way for an employee. So for example, I actually had a coworker who was Muslim, and they prayed numerous times a day. And so my boss actually sat down with this employee and asked about the details of the prayer and practice so that we could accommodate and provide a space for this person that was religiously appropriate for their prayer and ritual so that they could feel comfortable in practice every day. And that went a very long way for this employee. So you can see that feeling that piece of inclusion and like people around you care can really allow this person to feel a connection to the company and organization, and sets a very impressive tone for everybody around to show, hey, we're inclusive to people that may practice this faith, and so we all need to be on board with creating a safe space for this person. Another category or issue that we've seen come up pretty often is attire. So a lot of workplaces have uniforms and have attire that or guidelines for uniforms or things like that. And some religious practices have headscarves or other pieces of clothing that they need to wear for religious reasons. And so being a workplace that is able to accommodate for that and that is open and accepting to that as well. So next, we're going to talk a little bit about disability. And some important points to think about in terms of disability is that the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was put in place in 1990, so that wasn't that long ago, to protect or put protections in for people with disabilities in the workplace, is kind of the bare minimum. So employers have requirements for taking care of and providing care for employees with disabilities. But what we're seeing is that oftentimes it isn't enough, and it's not enough to actually create that environment of inclusion and support. So some of the ways in which we can be better able to identify what we need to do as companies to better accommodate people with disabilities is to just know what that might look like. So just because somebody doesn't look like they have a disability doesn't mean that they do not. So disabilities can be visible or invisible, and partly what we need to do in the workplace is to create a safe space where people, even if they have a disability that is invisible, that they're able to say, this is what I'm dealing with, and I need this accommodation so that I can do my work better. What we're finding is that a lot of people are feeling uncomfortable even opening up about it, and so they're not receiving the accommodations they may need, and so they're not able to perform the job that they need to in a way that is effective or efficient. And that's because that inclusion piece isn't there. It's not because that person isn't capable. So that willingness to disclose is very important, and that responsibility falls on, or a big piece of that responsibility falls on the employer and the people surrounding this person to create that environment where it feels safe for them to open up. We also want to promote people first language, so that's using people before the disability, so that you're not defining the person by their disability, but seeing them as a whole person first. So that's saying things like person with a disability rather than disabled person. So next we're going to talk about some very general gender differences that we see as being pretty prevalent in the workplace. And when we talk to individuals about concerns regarding gender in the workplace, when we're doing this diversity work, a lot of it is coming from the biases or the perceptions that people have of mothers or women in the workplace because they're perceived as childbearing. And so there's a lot of fear from employers about how productive this person will be, how focused they will be on their work, and whether they're going to leave the company or not. And so this brings into question the kinds of assumptions that we are making about women. Some women don't want children and are more focused on their career than that. But we make the assumption that that's what every woman in the workplace is going to do. And so we're finding that employers are actually treating women in a way that perpetuates bias because of those assumptions being made. And I think, yeah, so we're going back to the slide here. So just being more conscious of the way that you may be treating women in the workplace based on the assumptions you make about their work-life balance, about their focus on family, and about what their goals and values really are. So these statistics say that 61% of all mothers with children under the age of 3 are in the labor force. So we're finding that women aren't getting promotions, aren't getting raises, aren't getting positions in leadership because there's that fear that they're going to be there, they're going to have kids, and they're going to leave. But 61% of mothers with children under the age of 3 are still in the workforce. And then we talked about some of the other biases that occur with women commonly, which is being more frequently interrupted, which is being underrepresented in positions of leadership. And there's a lot of research coming out about how messages are received and how they're received very differently when it comes from men versus women. So there's a couple of research studies recently that have looked at just messages being given by a man versus a woman and what people's responses are. And people tend to be a lot more cooperative when they're hearing something from a male or from a man. So next, we're just going to touch on some basics in regards to sexual orientation and gender identity. So this is a very brief overview, but just some basic knowledge about what some of these things might mean. So when we talk about gender identity, well, we're going to go over all of these terms very briefly, but I think one of the main points that I want to say before we even go into these terms is that I want you to start seeing these things on a spectrum. So we typically look at these words, so we'll say gender identity, and we usually in our mind split them into two categories. So it's a binary, it's man or woman, male or female. And so we want to practice looking at these things as more of a spectrum, because we're seeing that that's actually more accurate than these binaries that we've created. So gender identity is referring to how somebody themselves identifies. So somebody's gender identity can only be determined by that person. And so this illustration helps us see that a little bit better. So when we talk about gender identity, I want you to think about it as housed in the brain, how that person identifies themselves. So we tend to think male or female, but if you see it, it's actually more along the lines of a spectrum. So someone can actually see themselves as in the middle of the spectrum, or not neatly fitting in the box of male or female. When we talk about sexual orientation, we're referring to that attraction level. So who is this person attracted to? And that's housed in the heart. And again, that can be a spectrum. So they may be attracted to men, or all the way on the other end of the spectrum, women, or somewhere in between. So again, really thinking about it in terms of spectrums. And then when we talk about biological sex, we're talking about traits that somebody is born with. So their parts, their hormones, those sorts of things is really getting at what somebody is born with. And somebody's gender identity may not necessarily match their biological sex. So even if you look at their birth certificate, it may say female, they may identify themselves as male, or they may identify themselves as somewhere in the middle as non-binary. So being sensitive to always keeping these things separate, a lot of times we assume that one can determine the other, when really they're all separate categories that can't predict the other. So biological sex is also considered on the spectrum. So we have this idea that when you're born, you fit very neatly into boy or girl, but that's not the case. So there are a lot of individuals who are born who don't neatly fit into these categories, whether that's because of hormonal differences that have them somewhere different along the spectrum, or that their actual parts and genitalia will place them somewhere in the spectrum that isn't one of those binaries. So always keeping in mind, again, that these things are separate and that they're all on a spectrum. And then gender expression is how somebody chooses to express themselves. And we're able to identify, especially in our society, a lot of ways of self-expression that are masculine or that are feminine, or that are more neutral or androgynous. So I want you to think about expression in terms of a number of things: how somebody's mannerisms are, how they groom themselves, and how they dress themselves. And so it's a lot more than just what somebody wears, but it's their voice, it's their mannerisms, it's all those sorts of things. And then again, just stressing that these identities fall in terms of a spectrum, and that you can't assume one because you know the other. And so just continuing to help keep these things separate in your mind. And then to push yourself to practice being an ally. And what that means is to just be a person that is open to hearing challenges that individuals that identify as being LGBTQIA, the things that they may need for an inclusive environment, and being willing to be that voice for them if you have the space to be that voice. And we have a lot of resources that we don't have time to get into today, but are on our website. So be sure to look those up in ways of being an ally for individuals that may identify with these groups. And then being mindful of language that you're using. So the biggest thing that comes to mind is pronouns. So a lot of times we assume pronouns. We see somebody, we assume they go by she, and so we start saying she, her, hers, but that might not be the pronouns that that person actually uses. So to be inclusive and to be an ally, something easy that you can do is just before having a conversation with somebody saying, what pronouns do you use? And allowing them the space to be able to identify for themselves. And then we're going to very quickly go through age. So age diversity is becoming more and more common within the workplace. We're seeing that there is potentially 4 different generations in the workplace at once. And so this is presenting a lot of challenges. And we need to understand the differences that can occur because of this age difference. So we often place value on certain characteristics that could be generational without recognizing that we're doing so. So for example, one big one is the work-life balance. So we tend to place value on somebody in a workplace that doesn't have a very strong work-life balance. But what we're seeing is that this is a generational characteristic in the workplace. And if we start to place value on it, then we're starting to exclude different generations and their way of practicing work. So things to consider are things like communication. Communication is changing with technology. So how does somebody tend to communicate, and what are your practices within the workplace? How can you communicate to your employees what the expectation is regarding communication? Even just the views on what diversity and inclusion is, the way that teamwork and collaboration is being viewed, how somebody prefers to give and receive feedback. All of these sorts of things can be different based on age. So we are running out of time, and I want to make sure that we have time for questions. So I will just close out with something that I want you to take with you. So I want you to take this question with you and really think about how identity of yours or how your social identities working together impact your experiences in your workplace. And think about it in terms of what kinds of advantages you may receive or disadvantages you may receive, and how it influences the way you impact with your workplace, or how you interact with your workplace and other people around you. And then just some things you can do. Continue your own education. We just very briefly touched on a lot of these different topics. And so it'll be important to continue your growth and understanding by doing further trainings, consulting with people that may know, and just using the internet as your friend and looking at research to try to figure out ways in which you can create a more inclusive environment. Again, we have some resources on our website at dapstl.org, so be sure to visit us and attend community events and trainings that we may have to offer. So thank you very much for your time and for listening into this webinar. I think we can open up to questions now, and we have a little less than 10 minutes to do so.
All right, thank you very much. Great information. There are not any questions right now, so feel free to type in your message box if you have any questions for Katrina today. We'll give you a couple minutes to do that and do our best to answer those. I also wanted to let everyone know that the recorded webinar today will be placed on the Higher Level YouTube channel later this afternoon. So if you want to look at that and review some more information, feel free to look us up on YouTube, and it will be up there this afternoon. All right, I do have one question that just came in, and they're asking, what is the silent generation? So the silent generation is, let me see, because different researchers will identify different generations in different age groups. So there usually isn't a total consensus about what each generation is. But when you look at, let me just look at my notes here. When you look at a lot of the research, it's talking about
individuals who are born mid to late 1920s and until maybe the mid 1940s or so. So it's identifying that group of people. But again, a lot of the research isn't consistent in exactly what the silent generation consists of or any generation consists of, because it's really focusing on what trends are, but it's around that time period.
All right, I have another question coming from Emma. She asked, what is the best way to help others understand microaggressions if they dismiss the idea?
So the best way to help others understand what a microaggression could be is to find a safe space or a safe environment to be able to open up to them about it. So whether that is to be able to provide trainings for that individual, send a request for a webinar, something along those lines, or to find a space in which you're able to discuss with this person or talk with this person about potential microaggressions that may be happening. And we find that doing so in a small, comfortable, non-threatening environment is the best way to approach somebody about that.
All right, let's see. Someone also had asked what you mean by utilizing diversity.
So what I mean by that is that what we're finding is that workplaces and communities that are more diverse are more productive. And so when you even look at the stats and the numbers, there is more productivity that comes with diversity. So just because the diversity is there, though, doesn't necessarily mean that you will be a more profitable company or that you will see the benefits of what diversity has to offer. So in order to actually see those benefits, you have to utilize the strength of what diversity is presented in front of you. And so what I mean by that is, how are you taking the differences of all of the people that are present and making sure all of their ideas are valued, making sure they're all comfortable enough to be creative, to be innovative, and to present their own ideas and understandings, and to insert their perspectives and backgrounds and unique experiences to the table. And that's how diversity is usually utilized.
All right, I do not see any more questions, so I think we'll go ahead and wrap up. Again, thank you everyone for spending some of your morning with us, and thank you to you, Katrina, for providing us with this great presentation.
Thank you so much.
Have a good rest of your day, everyone.
You too. Bye.